One of the things that I have been working with is natural pigments, and so one of the first things I did was try to come up with things that I could make natural pigments out of. And so one of the first drawings I made of just some rhododendron in a park, but the park actually had a stream running through it, and there was some ochre or rust river rocks, and so I made ground down some of the rust oxide river rock and painted with it, in addition to some ink and watercolor, but I used some of the river rock to pigment the paper and to paint with it. And some of the other, it was interesting because one of the things I was hoping to do is use the area that I went to is known for the haida or heather, the purple flower scrub that is in a lot of the fields, but actually that didn't bloom until that doesn't bloom until August, and I was there just early enough that it wasn't blooming, and I was late enough in the season that the poppies had already no longer bloomed. So I sort of missed that window of finding those kind of floral things, but I did get paper from the region and calligraphy ink from the supply store there. So I was using materials one way or the other from the area, so, which I find important in when I'm doing something about a project that is specifically about an area. I want to use as much of the materials or things and incorporate that into the work. So this is just an image of one of the factory buildings. It actually is still a working felt factory. They take wool and create felt for industrial use. And here I did some staining, and you'll notice in the background there are these patterns with the watercolor and then sort of superimposed with the calligraphy ink, and that actually is something I started with. When I first got there, I was so intrigued by the different textures, the different kinds of cobblestone and pavers that they had, and the textures of the buildings and all of that. And so my initial response was to sort of make studies, and I first did rubbings and then made just kind of watercolor studies of the textures. So in the background you kind of see some of the textures of the pavers that I was kind of emulating, and then I realized that I could kind of paint on top of that to kind of create this double exposure effect. And so this was another, I was fortunate enough to go on top of one of the buildings downtown, and you can kind of see off in the distance the texture of the roofs was just really interesting, the tile roofs that they had. And so this is one of the first drawings I made as well. This was the water wheel next to the apartment. So my apartment was just up here on the 3rd floor, and the library and the apartment was all part of what used to be an old mill. And so the water wheel was actually original to the mill, and there was still the Burma River would still pass by it. The water wheel wasn't moving anymore, but it was all sort of part of that, the history of that building, and so it was a neat place to live because you could hear the rush of the water all the time. This was an interesting thing. This, on the barns and in some of the houses and so forth, this double horse symbol was in a lot of different places. Sometimes the horses are facing away from each other, and sometimes they're facing towards each other, and And I heard it was an ancient symbol that sort of nobody knows what the origin of it is, but it's still sort of used a lot of times on farms and sort of as a kind of agricultural symbol maybe. So anyway, that was a neat, interesting sort of feature that I was curious about. Actually got some rose petals and made some ink. And the thing with rose and a lot of flower petal inks is that they're very fugitive. They don't last very long, or they don't keep their pigment. And so you see the kind of greenish color of the inside the rose. That actually is what the color of the ink turned after I painted with it. And the red is gouache that I painted over top of that. So it's kind of interesting. I noticed that a lot of the homes just had these incredible gardens, and so they really took pride in these very topiaries and strange gardens and so forth. So it was really interesting. While I was working with the letterpress folks, this is just one of their brochures of the letterpress club that keeps that sort of that craft alive. I was working with them, and we were talking about this rote faden is a kind of it's a saying that just says a common thread. So you're finding a common thread, but the direct translation is red thread. And so I thought, well, that would be an interesting way of conceptually wrapping up my project, was finding a common thread between me and this place. And so when I went to the letterpress guys, they helped me. This is called Fraktur script. The letter typeface was in that script, and then this roughly translate, I am searching for what holds the world together, and it's a kind of a, what do you call it, a paraphrasing of Goethe's, a quote from Goethe. So it's similar in that same idea of finding what holds the world together. It's this thread of commonality. And so that's what I sort of based the theme of my project on. And when I was making felt, because I kept going back to the felt factory because it seemed like one of the central kinds of cultural things going on in the town, and I was making this rope. I sort of ended with a red thread, and when I was discussing my work, I kind of was unraveling this and sort of saying, well, this is the beginning of a common thread that I'm finding in the work. This is actually some wool from the sheep that are in the region are called Heidschnucke. Heide meaning the heather, so they're the sheep that graze on the heather, and their wool, unfortunately, is not it's not very good for felting because it's almost like human hair. It's very long and coarse. But this is some of the raw wool that I picked up when I went out and saw some of the sheep. So actually, the meat of the sheep is what they're prized for. So they actually raise them for livestock rather than for wool. And I was also interested in trying to incorporate felting into my drawings. And so I experimented a little bit with felting into the paper with the needle felting technique that I used, which was not, I did a larger piece and it wasn't as successful, so I'm still working out still experimenting with how to use felting into my drawings. But I think that that's one of the things that I want to continue working on.